Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran with episode 120 of season 3. The last episode was about the failed siege of Srirangapatna. Cornwallis was forced to come to terms with the reality of what the road to Seringapatam required of him. That attempt in May 1791 had collapsed under an early monsoon, mud and death. Men probably from malaria and cattle from starvation. But in the course of that retreat to Bangalore, new hope presented itself by virtue of an unexpected union with the Maratha army arriving to help the British. Cornwallis returned to Bangalore with the forces of Marathas and Hyderabad and prepared for the next assault on Srirangapatna. And now, in December 1791, he marched the full weight of the Triple Alliance back towards Srirangapatna. And that is where I left you from the last episode. The question hanging in the air, could Tipu's capital, Srirangapatna, survive a second attempt? In this episode, we find out. But first, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their support. They make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. On the 6th of February 1792, Cornwallis attacked Srirangapatna. There is a case to be made, and I'm going to make it now, that Mysore actually fell on this day. Yes, it would be 7 years later, in 1799, when the walls of Srirangapatna were finally breached and Tipu Sultan died defending them. That is the fall everyone remembers, the one with the storming, the death, and the ending. But it was here in February 1792 that the fate of Mysore was sealed. Everything that happened afterwards, the slow 7 to 8 year decline, the cornered diplomacies, the final storming itself, follows from what was decided on this ground this month, February 1792. Tipu did keep his throne for 7 more years, but after this day, he could never again negotiate as a sovereign among sovereigns. Srirangapatna was not a fort in the way Bangalore was a fort, walls wrapped round a town. Srirangapatna was an island, a capital ringed by 2 channels of the Kaveri running around it, standing in for ramparts on every side, but the one engineers had reinforced with stone. Tipu had inherited this geography from his father and spent a decade making the most of it, building on the infrastructure of the defense. Bastions covering every landing point, guns commanding every crossing, and this is a capital that could only be reached by first fighting your way across a river under fire. On paper, it was close to unassailable, and that is precisely why Cornwallis chose to go at it in the dark on a stretch of bank that nobody expected him to reach as quickly as he did. How he did this was that Cornwallis did not wait for the formalities of a siege to run their course. That in itself tells you how much of verve he had on his second attempt, not the general who limped back to Bangalore 9 months earlier, cautious, methodical, undone by weather and by starvation. This time, with the earthworks barely finished, he decided he had seen enough of the preliminaries. Night was Cornwallis's preferred hour for the decisive blow. You'll remember that also from Bangalore, the empty cavalry tents, the infantry lying low behind the buns. He liked to make his enemy discover the battle was already lost before they had properly understood that it had even begun. So he turned that instinct now on Tipu's main camp, which was a heavily fortified position dug in on the north bank of the Kaveri, directly across the water from the fortress itself. It was close quarters fighting right from the start. There was no long-range bombardment softening the ground first. Just infantry going in the dark against an enemy who knew the terrain far better than the British ever did. In the warfare of the day, common wisdom was that sepoys would advance behind a barrage, waiting for the artillery to do the difficult work. In Srirangapatna that day, it was men crossing unbroken, unfamiliar ground at night, finding an enemy combatant by the flash and sound of his musket. and settling the matter hand to hand wherever the troops actually met. Fighting like men, as they say. British sepoys went in alongside Hyderabad's contingent, with the Maratha horse screening the flanks. The coalition that Cornwallis had spent 2 years assembling, finally fighting as one force on the battlefield under British command, instead of converging from separate directions the way it had been planned for most of this war. Mysore's gunners and pickets fought from where they stood. There was nothing tidy about any of this. But by the time the sun came up on the 7th, the British and their allies had cleared Tipu's forward lines, and they had planted themselves on Srirangapatna island itself. They were not yet inside the fort walls, but across the water, onto the ground that the fort was built to protect. Cornwallis himself took a minor wound in the fighting, but contemporary sources don't dwell on it, and neither will I, except to note that the commanding general had been close enough to the action to be hit at all, which tells you again something about how this attack was fought and how important it was to Cornwallis to risk life and limb right there on the front lines. But also think about what that foothold for the British actually meant. For 8 months, Srirangapatna had been an idea that the British could not reach, first protected by monsoon and slush and starving bullocks, and then by the Durgas like Nandi Durga and the others that had to be reduced one by one, and then by the sheer logistics of getting a siege train within range of Srirangapatna at all. Now in a single night, that distance had collapsed to nothing. The water in the river that had always been the fortress's second wall no longer separated Tipu from his enemy. It separated him from half his own army's forward positions. And this was only the first jaw of the trap closing. Cornwallis had never planned to take Srirangapatna with one army moving from the north. That plan had been drawn up more than a year earlier after the first failed attempt. This was a three-pronged convergence, a Bombay division under General Abercromby pushing east from the Malabar coast through the mountains of Coorg to complete the encirclement from the southwest. In 1791, that plan never got the chance to matter. The whole campaign collapsed before Abercrombie's column even arrived or became relevant. This time, everything was very much alive. Somewhere in the hills towards the west of Srirangapatna, Abercrombie was coming. Tipu had spent 8 years after the Treaty of Bangalore in the Second Anglo-Mysore War, rebuilding an army capable of making Europeans bleed for every mile of ground that they sought to advance. His lutis, irregular light cavalry, had stripped supply lines bare, and then they would vanish before they could be engaged. They had done exactly that to Cornwallis in 1791, and would go on doing it to every British column that tried to move with any respectable speed through this landscape. The British officer and chronicler Thomas Munro, who was no admirer of easy praise, would later record Cornwallis' own private verdict on them. He wrote it to his father in a letter dated 17th of August 1792, months after the fact, prompted by nothing more dramatic than a raiding party of lutis making off with 9 elephants near Savanadurga. Thomas Munro had quoted Cornwallis in the letter to his father as saying, "There wasn't a luti in Tipu's army who wasn't a better soldier than any of the 3 generals commanding against him. And without Cornwallis' own personal arrival, Tipu would have been more than a match for any of the British generals." Mysore's cavalry remained the finest light cavalry in India's military history. But a fortress under simultaneous pressure from 2 directions is not a problem that irregular cavalry, the lutis, could solve. Lutis win wars of attrition against supply lines. They cannot on their own break a pincer movement closing in around a capital. And that is precisely the position that Tipu found himself in. Beaten not in the open field, where his army was still equal to anything that the British could field, but in the one kind of a fight where speed and harassment cannot substitute for numbers, a siege, with the enemy already across his outer defenses and a second army closing in from the one direction that he had left uncovered. And he would spend the next 10 days finding out how bad that was. Now for a commercial break, and when I come back in only 30 seconds, more about the siege of Seringapatam. Right after this. Abercromby arrived between the 16th and the 19th of February that year, 1792. He had marched his Bombay division the long way around, east off the Malabar coast, up through the Coorg Mountains, terrain that had swallowed British columns before and offered no guarantees this time either. The Coorg passes were exactly the kind of country that had undone British movement elsewhere in this war, forested, easy to ambush, hard to supply, all of that. Abercromby's march was slower and more cautious than Cornwallis's own, but he held it together, and the army arrived close enough to the appointed moment that the two halves of the plan could still meet as intended. A year later, in the chaos of that first failed campaign, that kind of synchrony would today have seemed like a fantasy of the past. Not that it ever happened. Now it was simply what happened when logistics, coalition, and timing were finally allowed to work as designed. Abercromby swung his forces around the southwest towards the fortress and dug in. With that single maneuver, the investment of Srirangapatna was complete. Cornwallis held the north, Abercromby held the southwest. Tipu Sultan, who was the ruler of a kingdom that 8 years earlier had fought the British to a standstill and dictated his own terms at Bangalore, was now pinned inside an island fortress with hostile armies on two sides of the water and nowhere left to turn. For a commander who had built his entire military reputation on movement, on the looty speed, scorched earth, on making his enemy fight the land as much as the army itself, this was the one shape of war that speed couldn't answer, as I said. You can't outmaneuver an encirclement from inside the encirclement. Still, Tipu tried. On the 22nd of February, Tipu threw his forces at Abercromby's position in a direct assault. It was a last attempt to break the weaker seaming of the two arms of the pincer before it could fully consolidate. It was, in its way, the last independent decision that Tipu would make as a fully sovereign ruler. The last time he would choose to fight rather than to negotiate. He picked Abercromby's position deliberately, reasoning that a division that had just completed a grueling mountain march would be the softer target, still consolidating themselves, not yet fully dug in with the thoroughness of Cornwallis's veteran camp to the north. It sounded like a reasonable plan, but it simply wasn't enough. Abercromby's men held their ground. The assault broke against it, and Tipu withdrew, having spent men and momentum he could now not replace. With that failure, something in the calculation changed for good. Tipu could read a map as well as any general in the world. Two armies dug in on two sides of the river he could no longer control, with the siege train close enough to begin systematic reduction of the walls whenever Cornwallis chose to start. There was no third option left to try. There was simply the arithmetic of the position, and the arithmetic of the position told Tipu that his fortress would fall if Cornwallis's guns opened fire. Just as well as Tipu could read a map, he could read the writing on the wall. So Tipu Sultan did something he had never done before, not to the British, not to Madras at 1769, not even in the darker days of his father's campaigns. He sued for peace. He didn't do this from any point of leverage. He was not holding ground that he could trade for terms. He just asked for peace with the enemy's guns already trained on Srirangapatna and the enemy's flag effectively standing on his own riverbank. Suing for peace is different from a surrender. A surrender, laying down arms unconditionally, handing the victor the final field outright, was one thing. Suing for peace is different. It was a request to negotiate, made from a position of real weakness, but yet a request all the same, offered while the fort's walls still stood and not one stone of Srirangapatna had yet fallen to the enemy. We stop here for a moment and measure the distance this kingdom had travelled in 8 years. In 1784 at Bangalore, Tipu had negotiated as an equal if not a superior, a settlement that returned prisoners, restored territory, and left both sides on paper at least exactly where they were before the last war had begun. There was no equivalence left in February 1792 this time. This was not a negotiated pause between equals as the last time was. This was the ruler asking his enemies what they would allow him to keep. That is the fall I mean when I say that Mysore fell here in 1792 and not in 1799. A fortress that still stands is not the same thing as a kingdom that can still say no. And somewhere in the British camp, in the days immediately after Tipu's request reached him, Cornwallis must have had a moment, private, unrecorded, but it's not hard to imagine, where the man allowed it all to sink in. Just 10 years earlier, he had stood on a field at Yorktown and sent a subordinate to hand over the sword of surrender because he couldn't bring himself to do it in person. He had crossed an ocean carrying that failure like a stone in his pocket. He had spent a decade rebuilding a reputation that no administrative reform could fully restore. And he had told himself, and everyone who would listen, that only a war could finish this job in Mysore. And only a war could finish the job of rebuilding his reputation. And now the son of the ruler who had made America toast his name at victory dinners, the son of Hyder Ali that the American freedom fighters had celebrated, was now in Srirangapatna, asking Charles Cornwallis for terms. Cornwallis had arrived in India a decade earlier, still introducing himself, in his own mind at least, as the general who lost America. He would leave it, whenever that leaving finally came, as the man who broke Tipu Sultan. Not every soldier gets handed the chance to rewrite a sentence that history has already passed on him. Whatever it is that a man carries out of a defeat like Yorktown, Cornwallis had just set a great deal of it right down on the banks of the Kaveri. He was not finished. There was more karma yet to settle, more of this campaign to close out. There was the negotiating tent, the terms, the price that Tipu would have to pay to keep the rest of the kingdom. And that is coming up in the next issue, with an ending that Cornwallis had every right to feel it was owed to him. In the next episode, Tipu Sultan had sued for peace and the guns had gone quiet on the banks of the Kaveri, but what came next in the weeks that followed would be fought with lawyers, vakils and commissioners instead of infantry, in a negotiation that was every bit as consequential as the battle that forced the moment. That episode, the Treaty of Seringapatam, is coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is the history of Bangalore.